Welcome to Psych Sessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. My name is Chris Hackala, and I'm your podcast host. In this series of conversations, we speak with folks who have made the leap from a traditional faculty member position to a role in a center for teaching and learning. The conversations focus on how individuals moved from faculty to a center and how that move impacted their work, their career trajectory, and their personal and professional identity. Along the way, we talk about tips, advice, and challenges that come from working in a center. Sit back and enjoy these chats on Psych Sessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. Hi. So this is a really interesting podcast we're recording. I'm here with Beth Luoma at Sacred Heart University. Sorry, Beth. I should have asked you your last name before we recorded. At Sacred Heart University, we're recording this in person. And this is only the second podcast I've recorded in person. The others I've done on Zoom because of pandemic and all sorts of things. But we're fortunate to do it in person, but also doing it in Beth's new center, in her new podcast studio. So, Beth, thanks for having us today, and welcome.
Chris, I'm delighted to have you here. It seems surreal. I feel like it was a few months ago we were on a Pod Network Zoom and you mentioned, hey, wait, I heard you're going to be a director. Can we come talk? And so it's kind of surreal to step back and be in this space and have you here at the center.
Yeah, it's cool to make these connections because we're doing the same job. But as we'll find out as we talk through this, is all of us do these jobs kind of differently. We all have different responsibilities and different setups. And I really like to have these conversations to sort of help people out there sort of understand that this is not a job that is really cookie cutter. It really is fit to the institution and the individual and the context of what's needed. So I'm really happy you're here. I'm love to see your space. I'm incredibly jealous of your space. I took lots of pictures. I'm going to go back and show my provost your space and maybe guilt her into giving me a little bit more space. But I'd love to start with the same question I ask people, and that is if you could trace a little bit of how you got here. And people are often sort of shy about this. I love hearing the whole story, starting from like where you're from all the way through, because I think it really helps contextualize things. So I'll turn it over to you to give us a little bit of background of where you came from.
Absolutely. And I'll mention that in the past year or two, I've come to understand my story in a different way. So I'll talk about that as part of it too. But I grew up here in Connecticut. I grew up in Shelton, Connecticut, home of the wiffle ball, which many people don't know, but that's our pride.
That's the home of wiffle ball?
It is.
I didn't know that.
It is a really modest factory where it's built. It's a brick building behind a chain link fence, but that's where all the balls are made. So
very exciting.
It is.
It's funny as you say that. I once lived in the town where they made all the Pop-Tarts.
Okay. We all have our claim to fame.
Go for you. Although it smelled great every morning.
I can't say the wiffle ball production smells the same. I'm
really
sure Pop-Tarts are better.
That's so interesting. Okay, so you grew up in Shelton.
So I grew up in Shelton, and really when I think about my career trajectory, I always end up talking about my time at Shelton High School with my biology teacher, Mr. David Prizzuto, who was a fantastic instructor. And I feel like that planted the seeds both for me as someone who wanted to become an educator and someone who wanted to become a biologist. He had that bulletin board on the side of the room, and it said it's all a result of random genetic variation. It was with like the construction paper DNA double helix popping out of the wall, and he always pointed to it. But it was such a foundational concept to have that in the room, and here I am so many years later can still picture that bulletin board and think about what that means for evolution and how we understand biology of like, oh wait, the foundation is there's a bunch of random variation, and what do we draw from that?
Yeah. And I think as you talk about that, that's so interesting how many of us can look back and see people, and I love when people mention names because you never know if these people are going to listen to it, but it's good to acknowledge these people who have had such a profound impact on our lives. I had an experience a few years back where I met the biology teacher. She was my anatomy and physiology teacher from high school, who told me I had an immature academic attitude and I needed to straighten up. And it had a big impact on me. I started working harder, studying harder, and I became very, very close to this person, and she really wrote me a letter of recommendation. And I ran into her at a restaurant after not seeing her for 30 years, and my wife liked to comment that I became a 16-year-old little boy again in front of Mrs. Kudrin. So it is nice to acknowledge those people because they did have this big impact on our lives.
Absolutely. So. And actually, in one of my recent career transitions, when that announcement had come out to one of my new jobs, I took the newsletter and I put it in an envelope and I mailed it to Mr. Prizzuto and said, I just want to remind you of what you started. I'm here today because of what you started with me.
Yeah, and that means something. I'm sure he was touched by that.
I received a really wonderful, handwritten note back, so that was great. So that was Shelton High School, public schools all the way through up until that point. And then I went off to Worcester.
Thank you for saying it the right way.
I said it to the right local.
Worcester. It's Worcester.
We'll talk about the spelling and how that doesn't match another time. But
it's fine. It's fine.
So went to the College of the Holy Cross. I would cite that as the most transformative experience of my life, with my 4 years there. The Jesuit education, thinking about education of the whole person, thinking about social justice, kind of coming out of a privileged middle-class suburban background in Connecticut, and really having my eyes open through my education at Holy Cross. So not just being raised as a biologist, but being raised as a person. I really believe in that so wholeheartedly.
Yeah, and coming from Springfield College, that's our motto, is spirit, mind, and body, and service and leadership to others. It's one of those things that we all embrace at our institution. But I think it's one of those pieces of higher education that is sometimes lost on students when they think that this is my career and this is all I'm going to do. But what you just described is something I think our students need to hear, and sometimes our faculty need to be reminded of, that the students are humans as well as just biologists or psychologists or physician's assistants. There's this whole other part. So it's great that you had that experience.
Absolutely, and especially emerging out of the pandemic and thinking about how we're instructing our students, right? To recognize our students as whole people coming to the classrooms, and also to give ourselves as instructors the grace that we are whole people too coming to the classroom. And so what does that mean for how we interact with each other? Ideally, I'm sure I will quote her so many times throughout this podcast, but my former supervisor, Jenny Frederick at the Poor Boo Center, would love to say people first, right? And that includes our interactions as staff, that includes our interactions as instructor and student. So important. I'm going to do another name drop.
Okay, go ahead.
So College of the Holy Cross, the other shout out has to go to Dr. Robert Bellin, who was my undergraduate advisor. And I had classes with him. I took biochemistry with him. He was my advisor because I was a biology major with a biochemistry concentration. He ended up being my research advisor, and I am still close friends with him to this day. We're probably in contact every few months. So he, looking back now, as an educational developer, I've come to understand why he was so effective in the classroom. So, I'll jump forward quickly for a bit. So I did graduate school at Yale and was really involved with the teaching center there. And that's where I started seeing the meta level of classroom instruction, like think, pair, share, or active learning. And going back to seeing how Rob taught, he had turn to your partner. So it was his equivalent of think, pair, share. And I realized how he just embedded that interaction, embedded that community building. So again, it's that other intersection, just like it was with Mr. Prizzuto, of education and biology, and kind of where it was pushing me. My two loves kind of there together. But Rob was really just an incredible mentor. He was the one who talked me through my decision-making about going to graduate school and thinking about pursuing it. I was in a place to pursue it thinking about teaching, but it was my fall of senior year. I'd planned to apply to graduate school, and I said, wow, PhD is a long time. I don't know about this. So I jumped ship. I decided not to apply to grad school. And I actually had a professor in the department take me aside, concerned that I was a woman and I was jumping ship because of family concerns. So I just want you to know, I did graduate school with 2 kids, like you can do this. And I was like, oh, that wasn't even on my mind at all. I just thought it was a long time and I'm not sure if I want to do it. But I think, surprised a few people in the department at the time that I wasn't pursuing graduate school. So I decided to get a job at that point. And I ended up working at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston as a researcher in Jay Bradner's lab, and that's another fantastic mentor of mine. Jay has just such energy and passion, and he was MD, PhD, so he had, he was MD, but like with the researcher identity, and so he had such care for his patients, and then would take that drive to our lab and say, we need to figure this out, right? Because we know there are the patients next door that are waiting for these results to inform their care. So that was really incredible. But as I sat in my time at Dana-Farber, I said, I really want to teach. And it's a little bit difficult to teach with a bachelor's degree. So no sooner had I been, moved to Boston, I was applying for graduate school anyway.
So you did 1 year at Dana-Farber?
I did 1 year at Dana-Farber.
Okay.
And so I applied up and down the East Coast. My then boyfriend, now husband, was also applying to graduate school up and down the East Coast.
The two-body problem.
Here's the two-body problem.
It's never easy.
Never easy, and you'll hear how it gets a little bit more challenging for us too. So I ended up with my choice of graduate schools up and down the East Coast. And I wasn't planning on coming back to Connecticut, honestly. And I was even, I was looking at a school in the north, as we say, north of us, at Yale, in the Boston area, in the Cambridge area. But it's Harvard for anyone who missed my reference. But I ultimately was drawn to Yale because of the emphasis on teaching within the biology program. So graduate students were required to teach 2 semesters. Rather, some other schools where I applied, it was kind of, we know the one student who taught that one time. It was very much embedded in the program. And I was hearing whispers of this graduate teaching center that could be a support for graduate students. So I ended up selecting Yale. And in the meantime, my now husband had offers that didn't come through at first, but later came through for a full ride at Georgetown. So we decided it's far. It feels long on Amtrak.
That's far.
So we decided, okay, we're going to do this for a year. And so I went to Yale. He went to Georgetown. We said, whoever has the program with the better fit, they'll remain in place, and the other one will travel too. And so Yale ended up being a really great fit for me. And so my husband ended up leaving Georgetown. He took his data skill set he acquired as a political scientist to a career in institutional research.
Oh, okay.
So we both have kind of progressed through academic administration. He's a director of institutional research at a Catholic institution, and now I'm a director of a teaching center. Went to Yale. And I think within the first few weeks, I showed up knocking on the door of the Graduate Teaching Center of how do I do these programs? Like, I'm really interested in teaching. And I think it was actually still Jenny Frederick at that time who said, hold on, you need to do your teaching first.
Yeah,
I said, okay. So I went back and did my teaching assignments, loved that. Got involved with our Certificate of College Teaching Preparation, so a series of workshops and things you can do throughout your graduate career, including a portfolio, wrapping up your experience. And I went to the workshops that were facilitated by my fellow graduate students in ineffective teaching methods. And the more I did, the more I did. So I saw these students and I was like, this is fantastic. I talked with them after and they're like, Beth, you should apply to be one of our McDougall Graduate Teaching Fellows who lead the workshops. So that was how I got sucked into educational development. I didn't necessarily, as that high school student growing up in the home with a wiffle ball, think I'd be ending up in educational development, right? But we all have these different pathways in, and that was my way in.
So, and it's interesting because choosing Yale at the time, I think, and my timeline might be off, but Peter Salovey is still the president. And when he became the president, one of his focuses was on making Yale the teaching Ivy. And I remember hearing about that, and you hear people say that, but I've been to the Pourvu Center, and it's not just about lip service. There's financial and physical backing to support effective teaching at Yale that you don't see at other places. Now, Harvard has the Bach Center, which is actually quite well funded and quite good as well. But I think that Yale really did step up when Peter Salovey took over and had that perspective that he wanted to make Yale the teaching Ivy. And so I think you landed at the right spot at the right time for your potential career. And so you're in grad school and you are studying biology, but you're also studying educational development.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And we'll be moving up to that inflection point because it was right around that time that Peter Salovey had made that statement of Yale is to be the research institution most committed to teaching and learning. And that's something that the Pourvu Center embodies so wholeheartedly. And as you've said, has, I think, really driven a lot of institutional support that's been crucial. So I had that love of biology. I mean, I did well in my graduate work in terms of research, but on those days that research didn't work, so I was a biologist, cell biologist doing tissue culture, right? And you can have those experiments set up and someone accidentally sneezes, I like to joke and say, in your tissue culture dish, and it somehow becomes contaminated, you lost 3 weeks of work. That was hard for me. And as someone who could then go that evening and facilitate that workshop with my peers about effective teaching, I could say I did something that mattered today. And I think that really drove me in terms of feeling like I was making an impact, and maybe that's my own kind of personality disposition of wanting to make an immediate impact. Again, I acknowledge and admire all of the wonderful researchers out there, but for me, I needed that daily kind of evidence that I'd done something important. So those workshops were fantastic. And what I really loved about my experience in the then Graduate Teaching Center at Yale was the interdisciplinary connections. Just meeting my colleagues and peers across graduate programs. I was co-coordinator my last year of graduate school with Sarah Ronis, and so she was from religious studies, and the two of us led our team of about 20 teaching fellows, and just fantastic. It was fantastic is the best summary I can give for those conversations. And so you finished your PhD. I did.
And then where'd you go from there?
Yes. So at that time, I kind of had 2 to 3 years of educational development experience under my belt part-time. I'd gotten involved already with the POD network and been attending those conferences, which were really informative of, these are my people, right? This is a community where I really feel I belong and that I can contribute. And so I did a cold email. Again, I said I'll mention Jenny a million times over, but I did a cold email to Jenny Frederick. I'd taken the Theory and Practice of Scientific Teaching, a graduate course with her. And I emailed her to say, I've loved this work at the Teaching Center. You know, is there anything available on the horizon? And she said, Beth, we've just had 3 grants come in. We should talk. So came in and talked about a few opportunities, and one that was on the table was becoming the STEM education program director at the then Yale Teaching Center. This is preceding the naming. And so I had the opportunity to lead a national faculty development program in collaboration with a wonderful community of faculty leaders that have, this came together in 2004, really under the leadership of Joe Handelsman and others. But it's the now National Institute on Scientific Teaching, was the Summer Institutes on Scientific Teaching, but basically these 4 to 5 day institutes held throughout the United States on active learning, inclusive teaching, formative assessment. It really brings the faculty together to have that immersive experience in educational development that they may not be able to kind of get in throughout the year in terms of course design.
So let me ask you, this is really interesting. One of the things that I have seen in my time of doing this kind of work is that faculty vary in terms of how much they're willing to embrace some of this work. Did you, as a graduate student, run into any resistance to some of the things you talked about with either faculty or other graduate students as the teaching using, say, active learning or some of the strategies? I've heard faculty say it just seems like it's a little bit too much. It's not the faculty member's job to do. I'm curious if you've seen or heard any of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've considered that question before, but it's really interesting to consider it as a graduate student educational developer too. So one thing I think to own about both the work I did as a graduate student and the work that a lot of us do at teaching centers is we are often working with the willing. And so as a graduate student especially, right, these were the students who were already doing their dissertations and said, I want to do more. I want to do this optional certification in how to be an effective teacher. So I would say that most entered the conversation with a lot of openness and a lot of willingness to learn. And so kind of paralleling that to working with faculty, again, I think we often work with the willing. I can think of a few examples where work I've been involved with is part of something required. New faculty orientation, for instance, would be interested in that, right? It's an opportunity to be connecting with all faculty. But absolutely, there's pushback. And I think what you kind of subtly said there, Chris, was time as a barrier. And now I'm going to cite my colleague, Megan Bathgate, and her team, who've done some fantastic work looking at faculty implementation of evidence-based practice and looking at supports and barriers, right? So how do we build up the supports for faculty, whether it's the ability to connect with a peer down the hall, whether it's to have funding available to do that new innovation in your classroom, bring in that speaker or whatever it may be, whether it's the support of your department chair, whether it's institutional planning sessions, right? All these levels of supports and how those can relate to the barriers that faculty experience, right? So the lack of time, honestly, time comes up the most frequently, and then the survey results that I have seen, the lack of a support from an institutional leader or a direct pushback. And what Megan and her team have found is that the supports are more important than the barriers. So I find that really informative for our work as educational developers, is that we can recognize that those barriers will be in place. They're always going to be in place, including that personal management of time. But if we can provide enough support to, I'm going to go scientist on you, catalyze that reaction, right? Like to decrease that activation energy, there's really an opportunity for us.
Yeah, it's really interesting because as you say that, I get the new faculty for 2 days, new faculty orientation for 2 days. And in the time that I've experienced at Springfield, it's been 4 years, the number of people who attend events, it goes up and down based on all kinds of things. But I get a lot of new faculty because they see the value and they see the support versus some of the more senior faculty who have not experienced the support. So I think that's a really interesting observation.
I think it leans into what we know as educational developers in terms of conceptual frameworks. You're entering an institution, and if we're there on the ground floor with our new faculty to build up the conceptual framework of what it means to teach in this environment, this institution, it's a different opportunity than those of us who have been at an institution for X number of years and are trying to then adjust how we're approaching the work that we're doing.
Interesting. So you're at Yale for how many years?
A total of 12.
12 years, graduate school all
Between
the way
graduate school, and then as we were talking about before, right out of graduate school, I stepped into that role as STEM education program director. Was helping to co-coordinate. I worked with Tracy Addy as my co-director of the Summer Institutes in Scientific Teaching, and I hope the listeners can hear me smiling as I'm saying Tracy Addy's name. It's just a wonderful, wonderful colleague.
Yes, she is.
And so, where I was able to co-direct with Tracy, and then also I directed a teaching postdoc program.
Okay.
So we had our Helmsley postdoctoral teaching scholars. They taught in math and in physics at Yale and at our two partner institutions.
Okay.
So they taught at the University of Bridgeport and at Housatonic Community College.
Okay.
And that cohort was, again, just fantastic. You know, we still do reunions from time to time to see how they're doing. Most of them have gone off to faculty careers of their own at this point. But I think that was a place where I first experimented with some of the techniques that I use most frequently now, working with faculty, working with those postdocs in terms of fostering a learning community. I was basically doing an early version in my career of a faculty learning community with them. So that was really formative. Being in that director position was really informative for my approaches now. So we kind of accounted for some of the years, but not all of the years yet. So the remaining years leading up to my current position included a quick dabble in research administration. So I went back to my science roots, and I was a assistant director of women's health research at Yale for a bit. And I was not home anymore. I was ready to come back to educational development, but it was nice for me in terms of discernment to say, is this the direction I want to go? And because I still very much identify as a scientist. Like, how much do I want to step away from that? But I was like, nope. The heart and the identity are still in educational development. So Jenny Wright brought me right back to the Poorview Center. And at that time, I joined the Faculty Teaching Initiatives team. Okay. And this was in January 2020. Okay. So 2 months before we went online. So it was good timing. Good timing. Looking back, right? So 2 months to be in person with the team and kind of get to know my new teammates. And then somewhere, I don't know, March 11th-ish, Jenny turned to me and said, we should probably start thinking about a website. And Chris, we need to go online. And I remember starting the first Google Doc of what things would we put on a website for our faculty to navigate this.
Those dates are etched in many of our minds.
They are.
Right around that time.
Exactly, the March 11th, March 13th.
March 13th for me. It's March 13th.
Yep, exactly. So all of those pieces.
Yeah.
I had conversations with colleagues after that, and I think being on that faculty development team during that time really accelerated my growth as an educational developer because it was just so fully immersive and trial by fire, and it accelerated the number and depths of relationships I had with faculty.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, one of the things that I think many people I've spoken to have said is that although that was a really difficult time in terms of the amount of work we had to do and the challenges that we had, it has fundamentally changed the way that faculty developers, education developers are viewed by institutions. And it's one of those topics that I think is going to continue to be discussed as we move forward. And I think that as we sit in educational development offices, being considered more and more when conversations are happening about policy and procedures, because they recognize the value that we bring to the table. Because, let's be honest, in many cases, it's curious to know what would have happened had some institutions not had people to help lead some of the initiatives for when we had to transition to remote teaching during pandemic, because the faculty really leaned into. I know they leaned into our office quite a bit, and I'm sure they leaned into Yale's office. It was a time where I got to know faculty who I had not seen very much darken my door. They darkened my Zoom room. because they were there and they wanted to know how to do these things. So I think it really was a pivotal time for our field.
Absolutely. I think the Pourvu Center had been named, I'm going to blank on the date now because I was out on maternity leave, 2018, 2019, somewhere right around there. And so to see how quickly the name Pourvu, you didn't even have to say Pourvu Center for Teaching and Learning. Pourvu became a brand name at Yale that people knew, very centrally located with the institution. I need help. I'm going to go there first. And, as simple, that's the Pourvu Center is a large integrated center for those who are less familiar with it, right?
Yes.
It's really, it came together around the 2014, 2015. It brought together about 7 different units on campus together, plus forming the new faculty teaching initiatives team. So anything from, our grad writing support, grad teaching support, undergraduate tutoring, online education, our LMS support, our learning management system support, all of that in one place. But being together in that one place at the start of the pandemic, and literally our faculty having a single email address, ask Pourvu Center at Yale.edu, that they could message and say, where do I go? And we had the internal mechanism in place, really thanks to some of our digital education colleagues, to be able to say, yep, we're going to get you to the right person immediately. It was incredible. And, I very much carry the Pourvu Center as a model as I've come to Sacred Heart now as a CTL director, starting with a small center, right? But with the vision of that type of integrated infrastructure to move forward into.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting transition. I'm glad you brought that up. So now you're in this new position. You've been here for how many months?
Almost 3.
3 months in a new position in a new facility.
Yes.
With a new staff.
Yep.
And I like what you said about bringing with you this idea of what it could look like and thinking about scalability because you don't have the personnel. The Pourvu Center is like the Derek Bach Center and the CIRLT. These are big centers with lots of people. You and I run centers with much fewer people, but those missions that we have, I think, mimic what these other centers try to do in some ways by providing broad-based support. And so I think that's really a nice way to think about it. But one of the things that I find so fascinating is that when you don't have all the people in place, you have to think about how you can meet the needs of everybody in a way that makes sense. So I'll be curious, as you start your first academic year here, what do you see as some of the really big things that you're going to put forward, and what are some of the things you're going to try to maybe bring on board as time goes on, or how do you see your center sort of rolling out with the faculty here at Sacred Heart?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Chris. So one thing I'm thinking about is what this juncture means for the center, right? So we have very recently become the Center for Teaching and Learning, and not in quite the same merger context of 7 different units coming together on campus as it was in the Pourvu Center. We've brought 2 units together here. So when we say Center for Teaching and Learning, we're literally bringing together a teaching-facing unit with a learning-facing unit. So we have an instructional designer, Alex Diadamo, who is part of a previous center that was focused on faculty development, which we call SEAT here as the acronym. And on the other side, we have our learning supports. So we have our tutoring services, we have 150 or so peer and professional tutors. We have our writing support. There's an online writing lab where our students can submit papers for feedback. We have classroom learning assistants. We have our learning labs. And so those are all now coming to be in the same organizational location. And I truly see that as an exciting opportunity. Because it's a place where what we're learning from the lived experiences of our students here on campus and the learning supports they are seeking can then inform what we are doing with our faculty in terms of educational development and vice versa. I also see that as an opportunity in ways that we can be advocates for the incredible instructors that are here as we spoke with our students. Do you realize what these instructors are trying and how they're being innovative and how much they support you? I really just see that as, we as a center can allow the data from both sides to inform one another. I think another priority that I've heard over and over throughout my interview process and as I've started here at Sacred Heart is thinking really intentionally about inclusive and equitable teaching. Again, we've talked about emerging from the pandemic context. We've talked about both of our institutions and having missions that are dedicated to education of the whole person. That's something that really excites me in kind of coming home to a Catholic institution since I was at Holy Cross is how do we think about alignment to an institutional mission that has care of the whole person, that has social justice, and how that informs the work that we're doing here with our students and with our community, because Sacred Heart really does a lot in terms of community engagement. We have an office for volunteer programs and service learning that's really impressive. And so how do we just think about all those collaborations? So in terms of priorities for me as we're emerging, priority number one for me right now is listening and learning, right? So I can come in with some ideas of a vision and things I've seen, but at the end of the day, what matters the most is getting to know the instructors and students that are here at Sacred Heart and our incredible staff, and understanding what units exist, where there are synergies, and how we can build on those.
Yeah. Will you teach?
I aim to teach.
Okay,
yes.
You aim to teach.
Yeah.
Because I do think that is a nice way to keep your finger on the pulse. And what you just described is of course, I think, a really good model for when people take these jobs. You really need to understand, and it comes back to something I said earlier, the context of the institution. Because institutions really do vary in terms of how they sort of exist, and there's a history. And one of the things you said is that there was a different center here at one point. I think it was a center for
excellent innovative teaching.
Yeah. So these there's vestiges of these pieces around, and you're working in a context in which this existed before in a different way. And how do you move forward in a way that shows that your view might align with some of those pieces, but not all of them, and you need to convince folks of the value that you add to the institution. And I think that that's a piece that is really, it requires you to listen. Because when you listen, then you know what they need, and then you can help them with what they need. And it will often align with what you think they need anyway, but because it comes from the faculty and from the students, then there's more ownership on their end, and you're more likely to get people to go along for the ride with you. So I think that's fantastic. And I think as you begin your time here, it's going to be really interesting to follow up and talk about how your faculty here might be similar and different from the faculty that you worked with at Yale. Because I know that at the institutions I've been, I've had wonderful faculty colleagues at every institution I've been. And I know people say that all the time, but I mean that. I've also had faculty who have been difficult to work with, as everyone has, right? So I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish about this, but you have wonderful faculty, but the way that they operate within the context of the institution does vary. At my current institution, for example, we tend to have very small classes. And we have a lot of people who are upset when classes get 50 to 60 students, and it's a lot of challenge, and I hear a lot about how much that work is, and it is a lot of work. There's no denying that. But at Quinnipiac, the average small class was 60. So my intro psych class was 60 students, and they said we were able to get you under 100, so you have 60 students. So it's just a different context, and it's just a different sort of set of variables you have to work with. But it's the same kind of thing. You're teaching and learning. So I think that it is good for you to do those kinds of things, and I'll be curious, as I said, to follow up. Now, I want to go back to what I ask people all the time, and that is, as you look back on your educational development career, I'd love to have you comment on something that you think is sort of the best way to describe it is one of your go-to processes, strategies, things that you do to help faculty that is sort of broad-based. So, for example, if you have a technique that you think faculty across disciplines can use, or if you have a workshop or an activity, I'd just be curious to know what things you think are sort of in your wheelhouse for doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll go back to what I said before when I was talking about the Helmsley Postdoctoral Teaching Scholar Program that I led, because that was kind of the seed of thinking about faculty learning communities for me. And so I think that's one of the places that I gravitate toward as my bread and butter. That's for a few strategic reasons, right? There's something to be said about convening instructors to just talk about teaching. There's something to be said about breaking down the silos of individual departments and disciplines to bring faculty together across disciplines to have those teaching conversations. And there's something to be said about sustained interaction over the course of the semester, right? So I absolutely think that CTL should offer a menu of entry points, right? Those one-off workshops do hold a purpose and can be very valuable.
They do.
But at the same time, too, in terms of implementation and change over time, coming back to Megan Bathgate's work in terms of thinking about supports, having that support throughout the semester, that community that faculty can return to, can come to know and trust and be vulnerable with and say, this is what flopped this week. This is the difficult situation I'm having, and receive that feedback and brainstorm ideas. And again, as I've been reflecting on my educational development practice, and I go back to that first, what I would say the first time I facilitated a learning community like that was with those postdoctoral teaching scholars, I realized my approach came from small church communities. And so I, as a graduate student, was very involved at St. Thomas More, which is the Catholic chapel and center at Yale. And small church communities can take many different forms, but they have so much in common with faculty learning communities as I'm taking into the faculty learning community literature. And so these are communities that typically get together, say, every week. You can set different frequencies. In the particular case, I participated in one for 11 semesters in a row throughout my graduate career. So we'd meet Mondays at 7:30 in our student center, church student center basement, and we would come together. We'll talk about the structure and then say how that relates to the faculty learning communities. We'd come together and do a check-in, right? Around the room. How are you today? How are you this week? What's going on? And then we'd say, okay, so we know that the readings coming up for Sunday service are these. Let's take a minute, let's read them, let's reflect on them, and then move into a space of kind of planning and action. So, okay, based on what we read, what are we thinking about this means for how I'm going to live my life today, this week? And then, kind of have that send-off at the end, kind of, in that case, it's a religious contest, so there's a prayer, but some sort of send-off and out. And then accountability when you come back the next week. Because you've got that check-in in the start, and it said, oh, Chris, you were talking about that thing you were struggling with. Like, how's it going? Is there something else I can do to support you? And so I realized I really drew from those themes in terms of how I approached facilitating a faculty learning community, which isn't that much different than when you go dig into the FLC literature, right?
No. What's interesting as you talk about that, too, is that those kinds of accountability groups exist in many aspects of our life.
Yes.
And we're just taking something that has been shown to work in many other areas and applying it in higher education. As a side note, there are two people who I've interviewed recently who say they can't get faculty learning communities to work. And I think it really does. It depends on who you are and how you view things. And so it's like what you keep on your tool belt that works well for you. So I think that's really interesting that you find them to be very, very effective and helpful. And I think the accountability piece is really important. So that's great. Are there things that you've tried that you've seen other people do that you can't pull off or that you have not been able to get to work, or things that you'd like to try more of? I'm just sort of curious, and I love to ask this question because I have had some things that I've tried that haven't worked very well, and I'm always curious to hear, maybe share in some of that feeling of defeat with other people, like, oh, this should have worked. So I'm just curious if you had anything.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, you've heard me talk a lot today about listening first, and I think that comes from lived experience of places where I didn't listen enough to start. And so that first position coming out of graduate school where I was helping to co-coordinate these Summer Institutes on Scientific Teaching. So let me take a step back. One of the most valuable experiences I've had as a professional is participating in management training and having done 360 feedback. And so I did that early on in my career where I had feedback directly from my supervisors, feedback from the peer colleagues, and then feedback from my direct reports, all anonymized. And in that feedback, it was done at the time that I was part of helping to lead the Summer Institutes. We had some of the faculty leaders give me feedback there. And I remember one of the faculty leaders had said, Beth does a great job, blah, 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 all overwhelmingly positive. But the piece of criticism there was sometimes doesn't ask enough about what's been already done. And I've taken that to heart ever since. I came in out of grad school so excited. This is great. I have these ideas I'm going to help bring together. You can see where, some of this is a little bit disorganized. I can come in and help with this. And I came in too strong. And so I really operate with that humility of trying to do... I don't think I've regretted a time where I asked a question first instead of speaking first.
It's so interesting you say that because... the whole idea of the way you just described that is really insightful for you to hear that feedback, and it's such a faculty member approach to focus in on the one thing that feels like it's critical. I know for years every time I talk to faculty about their student evaluations, I'll look at them and say, these are great. Well, yeah, but that one student said this. I think, well, that's one student, one comment, right? So I think, but I do think that comments come for a reason. And so you have to think about the reason. Maybe the reason is the student wasn't happy with you for a day. That's fine. But in this case, it might be that maybe, it is helpful for you to step back. I think that for a lot of us, and especially when we're enthusiastic about this, it's easy to just push forward and not to put on the brakes a little bit and to hear what other people have to say. And it takes a lot of skill and a lot of practice to see your blind spots and see where you need support. And one of the interesting things is that you've not spent time as a full-time faculty member before.
Correct.
So when you're a full-time faculty member, you own everything. Like you own everything. And it becomes interesting when you don't own everything.
Yes.
So I can tell you this is, talk about blind spots. I delegate terribly because I just do stuff myself. And I'm getting better, but I still don't do it well. And it's because I spent 20 years doing everything. And I think that as you recognize these blind spots and start to think about how to sort of navigate them, it helps you in your work with other people. And the more you can see your own, you can start to help people recognize things and sort of begin to make the adjustments that are going to make them more effective. And ultimately makes the center more effective because people really appreciate, even if they don't love it at first, support that moves them forward so they're doing things better. I had a faculty member say to me the other day that they were very annoyed, with a lowercase a, not a capital A, about some of the advice I gave them because it was going to create more work in the short term. But then the faculty member said, but in the end, it's just better. And I felt like that was a win, right? They might have been annoyed at first, but then they saw, this is going to lead to better teaching and learning. So I think that's really interesting. And as you come into a new faculty and a new group of people, it's going to be really important to do that because there's a whole bunch of personalities that exist on a faculty.
I think you brought up a good point too, Chris, in identifying me as someone who has had teaching experience but not been a full-time faculty in terms of the field of educational development, because we're at a juncture now, right, compared to when Pod Network first emerged, and we're thinking about the 60s and 70s, that frequently people who were starting in educational development had full careers as faculty members. And we're thinking about getting involved with teaching center work, much like yourself, you've had these really full career, and I'm going to be an administrator and be in this leadership role and really kind of mentor and help faculty. But now with the proliferation of teaching centers across campuses, we have a number of people like myself who have grown up academically in a space to be professionalized by a teaching center. And so it's really fascinating to think about the field as we all work together. I mean, I know part of this podcast is thinking about so many varied ways into this profession, but we have those who have been, tenured faculty all the way through people like myself who have come up through educational development into these roles.
Can you pause this? Yeah, so I think your point about different ways into educational development, it's really important. And there are questions on the Pod Network, the listserv about this, and people have different perspectives on it. And I think it's really going to continue to evolve over time. And I think as we talk about it, I'm curious what your thoughts are on, and I saw this somewhere, on pathways that go straight to educational development. And so your degree is actually in educational development. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Chris. And so, for me, I can speak of the perspective of someone who didn't pursue a degree directly in education, maybe sometimes muse about it. It's something I want to return to at some point, but had that embedded experience in my graduate career. So I'll probably speak somewhat from a point of bias just because of the path I have come out of, that absolutely the education, expertise, and knowledge is so crucial to this role. But I think also, too, is the relatability to a faculty member.
Yep.
And so though I haven't been a full-time faculty member, I have taught undergraduate and graduate courses. I've taught at Yale. I've taught at Southern Connecticut. I've taught as a graduate student. I've taught as an adjunct, right? So I've been in a number of these roles, and I can see how those perspectives infuse into my work. And also to be in that point where maybe I'm in a consultation and we're talking about, at Yale we use Canvas, we're talking about how you might have your course set up on your LMS. And in that conversation, I was like, oh, well, here, let me just quickly, this is on Zoom at that point, right?
Yeah.
Like, let me just show you really quickly, like, here's one way to do it, not the way, but here's one way to do it that's from my Canvas course, or I've seen this with other faculty. So I think there is that relatability piece that's important to faculty, that's important to maintain. Now, that being said, I think I want to think about our field as being open to many perspectives, to multiple ways of knowing. So that isn't, I think I would never want to be in a place where I'm totally prescriptive about what we need in educational development too, but to imagine that each teaching center could function as a unit that brings all these perspectives together, right? So to bring those who've had those full faculty careers and are stepping into administration, to bring those as myself that have grown up both as academics and as educational developers, and to bring those with the education expertise, because that's something I've already valued from my first 2.5 months at Sacred Heart, is having the expertise of our School of Education here. And, I'm already in conversation with a few of our faculty who I'm just, again, for coming back to listening, learning about the incredible things that are already happening here and may not be affiliated centrally with the center. An example is we have a peer coaching program run by David Title and Kristen Rainville out of our School of Education that dozens of faculty have participated in and have found great value in. So just acknowledging that the expertise of educational development can come from so many different pathways. And I think we as CTL directors serve an important role in convening spaces where all those ways of knowing and all those types of expertise are valued and heard.
It's a super interesting point. And I've thought about this a lot because my graduate program was so focused on teaching. It felt like a natural fit for me. The University of New Hampshire has this well-established program. And so it felt like a good fit to me. And I remember thinking if I hadn't gone through that experience, it would have been an uphill climb for me to get into educational development, even if I really liked teaching. And I think that there's this perception that if you're a really good instructor, you could run a teaching center. And I don't think that's it either. I think there's a lot of pieces that have to come together for it to work. And so it's as much about the background and training as it is about the individual and the skill set the individual has to be able to do these things and to be open to different perspectives and be open to hearing from other people. And so I think it's a really challenging question because I don't think there's an easy answer. It's just like when people say, how does your center run? Well, they all run differently. Everybody's got a different take on things. One of my dear friends, Victor Benassi, his center, and now Victor's retired, but his center did mostly science of learning studies with faculty. They didn't do a lot of workshops. They didn't do a lot of other things. They did science of learning projects with faculty. And that's very different than other centers that run a lot of programming or run social events. And the structures of these are all different. I reviewed a couple programs recently where they have a 2-year term of a faculty member. And so they're all different. And so I think as we move forward, I think that diversity is going to add to the overall field. And institutions do need to use a model that fits. But I will say this, institutions also need to adapt. And if, as an institution changes, if it needs more support or less support, they need to think about that too. So I think that's great. And I'm really happy for you to be here and to be not just here on this podcast, but in this space with these folks. I think it's a really nice fit for you, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity for Sacred Heart to learn from the experience you bring from the Porvu Center. And I think that your experience and all of the things that you've done are going to really add to the institution. So thanks for taking the time to talk to me today, Beth, and for sharing your space. It's been wonderful to do this live, well, not live, but in person, and in a space that is made for podcasting. So thanks for sharing your space, and thanks for sharing the day with me.
Thanks, Chris, for being here, for having me on the podcast. I was really honored that you extended the invitation, and also just a thanks from our community of those of us who are running small centers. I mentioned that I would be, the CTL director, and I can't tell you how many people mentioned your name and cited you as the mentor to go to in terms of learning about how to do this work. So thank you for already the mentorship you've provided and the conversations we've had.
Well, thanks, Beth. I appreciate it. And we'll follow up again at some point because I'd love to hear how your first year goes.
That sounds great.
Thanks.